which goes then to the next element, which is the way Trump 2.0, contrary to Trump 1.0, is this strange articulation of what still remains MAGA. So this kind of nostalgia for a world that never existed and the going back, and the technofuturism, which is there. So how these two are articulated. Also, one wing that of Trumpism that we haven't talked about very much, which is mostly represented by Scott Bessent, the finance secretary, are the private equities. So basically the plunderers, right? And so I wonder, escapism means a lot of things. Escapism means escaping the state and creating your own private zone. But if the private equity continue to do their job in destroying the planet, escapism can be seen in the pure Muskian way of, you know, once the Earth is destroyed, we go to Mars. So how does the past, cultivation of the past, which is also a meme coin, I mean, it's also very speculative, right? It's how you, after get your base to approve, operate with this sort of technofuturism and techno-escapism that develops.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, because I think he's an example of someone who draws actually more of a commonality with Trump 1. Trump 1 also governed largely with people drawn from Wall Street, people like Steve Mnuchin, Gary Cohn, Scott Bessent, and Howard Lutnick are also people from Wall Street. But they're not just from Wall Street in a vague sense, nor are they even from the kind of asset managing part of Wall Street. For the most part, in that version of Trump and this version of Trump, you have a lot of people from the so-called distressed debt sector. So this is not, you know, people doing, you know, managing pensions or doing kind of long-term investments in what they think are highly sustainable sectors of the economy. It's more like people from the world of hedge funds and in the case of Wilbur Ross, his former Commerce Secretary, bankruptcy lawyer, literally, who are trying to figure out ways to turn companies that are not producing enough value into more productive companies, either by buying them up cheap and then stripping out assets and selling them off even cheaper, or doing what are called workarounds or turnarounds by, you know, transforming usually the workforce primarily and the kind of set of assets that the company might own, sell them off and sort of unbundle the corporation into its component parts. Another really interesting comment from Steve Bannon recently was that he defended this ongoing sort of assault on the federal state and the federal budget in terms of his own Harvard Business School training. So, and he said, you know, I was trained at Harvard Business School. I did turnarounds at Goldman Sachs. I know what needs to be done to a failing company to bring it back to profitability. And that's the same logic that he's bringing to, you know, the highest level of governance. One of the many ways where I think there isn't as much distance between the super corporate minded Silicon Valley or Wall Street people in Trump's coalition and someone like Bannon. I think he just sort of uses different language to get to the same place. So I think that is, first of all, like a short-term vision that is often about, you know, shedding surplus labor, trimming things that are seen as useless. Javier Milei's budgets in Argentina are a good example of this. You know, you slash scientific funding, you slash cultural funding, you reduce pensions and wages, because these are all, I guess, just the froth and the unnecessary parts of society. And then you drill down and concentrate on things that will improve your credit rating and make your lenders happier. So that, I think, still remains maybe the core of what's going on with MAGA, actually. But at the same time, of course, you're right that what Musk gives them, what Sam Altman gives them, is a much more high-flown language of saving humanity, either through colonizing Mars, which Trump mentioned directly in his inaugural address, or in more concrete terms, doing massive investments into artificial intelligence, which has now been described as a Cold War in such ways that are designed to kind of open the taps of maximal state spending and to give the private sector the impression that if they fund AI to the maximum extent, the state will be there as a backstop for whatever kind of investments they're doing. So there is this now kind of distant future threat that's been created of, let's be honest, it's like the computers run amok, becoming self-aware and somehow, I guess, wiping out humanity. That's actually how AI people talk about the danger. Concretely, it's China somehow acting as the unwilling or willing enablers for that future destruction of humanity by Skynet style, cyber enemies, non-human digital enemies. So that is now part of our everyday discourse in quite extraordinary ways. It's not just about 1 year out, 10 years out, it's about a millennium out. And meanwhile, what's bracketed is the much more concrete transformations of the conditions of human life brought about by climate change. You could say this fixation on the reign of Skynet that's coming, the killer robots, is almost like a displacement of all of the real anxiety that we have about accelerating killer storms and highly disruptive weather cycles onto something that is much more abstract. There is ambient anxiety and needs somewhere to go, so it goes there and it gets utilized by Silicon Valley investors as a way to pad their wallets and their budgets. But at the same time, indeed, there's this kind of look backwards, sometimes not to the 1950s, but in the case of someone like Chris Hegseth, again to the Middle Ages, Cross of Jerusalem tattooed on his chest, slogan from the Crusades tattooed on his arm. And there we're once again in a fight for civilization, but instead of the US against China over the future AI, who gets to stop the killer robots or make them first? It's about Christendom versus Islam. And what we know about the history of Western ideas of Islam is who Islam is tends to transform over the decades and centuries. Sometimes it's literal Muslims, and sometimes it's simply a fear of a vague, distant, non-Western other. In this case, paradoxically for the United States, that threat seems to come from south of the border, manifestly part of the Western Hemisphere too. So there's, I think, all of these kind of like swirling, phantasmagoric fears of the future, fantasies of the past, that I think we know possess the imagination of the top level of the lawmakers and elite in the United States. The question that I often have is about more ordinary Americans and at what point they get lost in this sort of, bewildering attempt to square the circle of medievalism and technofuturism, and whether they are in on this, whether they're seduced by it, whether they're alienated by it, but just going along with it. I have to wonder if things continue along like the path of maximal weirdness that they're on right now, at what point it doesn't end up having kind of counterproductive effects on the GOP's own legitimacy. It will depend on things as banal as the price of gas at the gas station, obviously, the presence or absence of eggs in the grocery store, and so on. But we're at a point where the kind of distinction between the utter kind of sort of kaleidoscopic, almost psychedelic quality of the ideology of the governing elite feels so distant from the everyday needs of ordinary working people that I wonder if that gap will produce political problems at some point.
At the same time, that gap has been around for a while, and at this point their popularity seems to be still swelling to a certain extent.
It is true, and there are all kinds of connective tissues between the world that they inhabit and those of average Americans. Not for nothing that, Trump appeared on all of the multi-hour podcasts as that kind of sign of his own connection to average people and so on. So yeah, it's true. We don't know.